Uh, Good afternoon and happy Teachers' Day, everyone. It's a wonderful day to discuss education and stuff. I have with me, of course, Ashwin and Chaitanya Kalipatnapu. There ought to be an online course on how to pronounce difficult surnames. They both are very interesting people who founded Eruditus Executive Education. And how many of you are MBAs here? Quite a few. Actually, as a journalist, we are usually cynical about anything that's an oversupply, and MBA is one of them. So when I was asked to do this session on Eruditus Executive Education, the first thing I did was to suppress a yawn. Then I realized that there is more to it than an MBA, as I kind of presumptuously thought. So one of the things that we have to learn always is to unlearn. So I'm not going to waste too much time because we have only 30 minutes and we are greedy enough to squeeze in some audience questions on this. So I'm going to let Ashwin and Chaitanya take questions as they feel. But the interesting part about Eruditus, as I realized, was that it's not about executive education. It's about disruption and democratization of education. And that's what makes it most interesting, because I was just on my Instagram yesterday and I came across a course from Udemy that offered me at rupees 720, which is less than half the price of a breakfast in this hotel, 52 hours of video education, videos, downloadable content and all. So just now I came up with a new expression which is sort of apt for today, which is that let's not talk of business model, we should talk of something which I would like to call pedagogy model. So I would love to know how things have been disrupted in the pedagogy model, and then maybe look at what Eruditus is doing. So let's have an idea of where does education today stand in view of technological changes, Ashwin?
Okay, it's a very broad question. I think education means very different things to many people. Somebody taking a MOOC course online will consider that education that can be free. Half the coffee priced education is one, and you have the $40,000, $100,000 degree education at the other extreme. So we have to understand what we are talking about. The way we approach this, at least, is to tie education to learning outcomes. Measuring learning outcomes, by the way, is an evolving process. But some metrics you have is you ask students at the end of it, did it help you in your career? Did it help you apply the skill? Did you upgrade your skill set, et cetera? And so for us, anything that is pure content, I would hesitate to call it education. Content plus learning outcome, we would call that education. And obviously in the online world, there's just so much more that you can do than actually I would argue in the classroom world. A lot of people talk about pedagogical when it comes to online. I would actually argue that you should have a longer discussion about pedagogical efficacy in the classroom, which, by the way, the challenge is you can't even measure it. But the stuff that's happening around here, synchronous, asynchronous, adaptive learning, tailored learning, application, a bunch of stuff that's happening. What we do is to work with universities who are obviously very good in the classroom setting to help amplify their impact online across the world. And I can talk more about how we do that, et cetera. But pedagogically, actually, I find online to be a much more rich area for innovation than having a captive audience like this sitting in a classroom. And maybe I'm being a little provocative.
Very interesting, because actually I met Mohanbir Sani from Kellogg School one day, and I saw him, and he said something very crazy. He said, Socrates was also teaching 60 people in a classroom. I'm also teaching 60 people. So nothing has changed in education for 2,000 years. So has it? So please tell me from that point of view.
I guess of all the sectors that are out there, education is the least disrupted. I think we work with Mohanbir for a bunch of his online courses. And how Socrates taught or Aristotle taught, I think it's the same, it's in the same way that it's being taught, maybe in the confines of a brick and mortar setup. What online is doing is two things. One is it again talks to our mission in terms of making high quality education accessible and affordable across the world. By access is earlier when we want a great education, we have to pack our bags, find a loan provider, get the visa, go somewhere and learn. Now the same universities we're talking about, be it Berkeley or MIT, they're able to deliver that experience to you wherever you are. Right? So that's a fundamental shift. Second, to what Ashwin is saying, even though there are 300, 400 people in Mohanbir's course on artificial intelligence applications for business, the technology is enabling to give specific feedback to you to say that how many videos you have watched and where are you in the learning journey, and to give specific feedback so that how you could apply better at your workplace.
So technology is not just a tool of dissemination, it's also a tool of measurement and feedback. So it's more interactive in that sense. It has elements of the old classroom in some ways, like a tutor or a coach in some ways. But first of all, it's almost unthinkable. It's like you're doing to education what cell phone has done to our lives in some ways, that you're talking about Berkeley, Haas, which are the brand name institutions that people only held in awe. But isn't this, Ashwin, to be provocative, kind of taking the sex appeal of some of these big schools? Like I went to Harvard,
what's wrong with
and
that,
I went to Berkeley. It's not the same thing as I took a Berkeley course online,
So first of all, nothing wrong about taking the sex appeal of the schools, but that's a different conversation. Let me actually phrase the answer this way. If you go back, and Pramath was here, 100 years ago, and if I ask you, how many of the US universities were in the top 10 universities worldwide? Anybody has an answer? Do you have an answer?
No. I'm still, it used to be Oxford and Cambridge and stuff.
So, the fact that I'm asking it obviously means it's close to zero. The answer is actually zero. 100 years ago, no Harvard, MIT was on the top 100. And then the question is, how in 100 years or 80 years have they gone beyond their sex appeal, innovated on their business models to actually be here? By the way, 4 of the top 10 universities were from one country. Do you guys know which country that is? Not UK. Shobana, you would know the answer. It was Germany. But today, on the top 20, none of them. So universities also need to innovate. They may be not-for-profit. They may be public institutions. They may be academic-oriented. And I think about them embracing online as an innovation. It's no surprise that Harvard and MIT came together to create edX. It's a very powerful statement made by 2 very well-renowned universities about the future of education, where that's headed. So that's one form of innovation. Of course, universities have to do many more. So I would actually like to think about us as partnering with universities in that innovation journey, because the skill sets they need to be relevant in the digital age is very different from what they need and what they've acquired.
Exactly. So let's hit on that. Let's hit on where the innovation is, as you have done it, and where it is heading. Let's have that from you.
So it's a funny anecdote. Dean of my school was saying, so I did my MBA maybe 10 years ago, and we go to every school you go to your 5-year reunion. So along with the invitation to the reunion, the alumni reunion, the dean, I would see that happening. The dean would send an email saying that, thanks for attending this program. It's been 5 years. By the way, your degree has been expired. I guess that's what's happening now, because when we were doing our education, there was nothing about digital transformation. There was nothing about digital disruption. AI, ML were non-existent or alien words per se. But right now, in terms of the innovation, what's happening is that, one, the schools are including this in the curriculum and in a far more engaging manner, which are application-driven. And online is making sure that's included in the particular journey. The second thing, what disruption that's happening is that I think Pankaj made a point of number of hops that a millennial is jumping between the jobs. So it's not necessary, I think maybe to be provocative, it's not necessary to invest 4 years at one go, get a degree, and do a job for 15, 20 years. Maybe all you need is a 6-month focused boot camp on a particular skill.
Very, very interesting, because I wrote about this 20 years ago when NIIT started this. There used to be this brilliant man, Sugata Mitra, used to think a lot about education. He's somewhere in the UK. And he coined the term called just-in-time education taking after the Japanese just-in-time inventory model. So he even coined a term called skill-led, like applet. It runs like a skill is acquired quickly and deployed quickly. So it's not just the pedagogy that has been disruption, even the absorption and the course content has been disruption. So you could call it a double disruption in that sense, right?
Yeah, and then if you tie that back to the earlier question about universities, it's a matter of time before they will be disrupted. So just to give you a statistic, in the US, there are 4,000 universities. About 500 of them already in the last 3 years have shut. By the way, if you look at India as an example, if you look at some states, Maharashtra, for example, Andhra Pradesh, an engineering seat used to be very coveted. Now you will find that about 40% of those seats are going vacant. And so I will come back and say that let's not assume that the universities who we talk so highly of today will be relevant 20 years, 50 years from now. Let's not assume that the educational models that we assume that work today will be relevant 20, 30 years from now. And in many ways, that is the opportunity that we see and many of us in this room see. And I really am optimistic about a partnership model. Like it will take us 100 years to create a university of the calibers we want to do. And for us, that's too long. Right? And so if we can find a way to partner with these universities to be more relevant in this digital age,
it's very interesting because I'm tempted to draw analogies. When I first heard about Eruditus and how it is trying to bring Ivy League education affordable, in my immediate analogies, I had a talk with Bertelsmann's Pranjal on that. Is this the Foxconn of education where Apple designs the Berkeley becomes something like Apple and you would become the delivering partner, dramatically lowering the cost. But then you had several universities, I thought of you as the Infosys of education, where, you had the Goldman Sachs and Bank of America giving outsourcing contracts and you doing something like that to education. Then, right now, the way you put it, it makes me think of you as a Chinese mobile maker or something like a Xiaomi or something. But is this it, or is this more of a partnership model? Tell me in the sense that if it is a partnership, where does it stand in terms of the future of the institutions you're serving?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it. So to give you an analogy, so in fact, I think we work with the universities across the value chain, right from getting to them with a market need in terms of which particular skill in which particular market. By the way, by access, we mean not just giving courses in English, but also in Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese.
Okay, there's a multilingual.
Yeah, right. So we go to the university first to say that this is the market need, this is the skill that's out there. Let's design, co-create the program together, right? So that's what Ashwin meant by partnership. So we work with them to co-create the course. Second, we work with the faculty in terms of adapting that to an online medium or a hybrid or a blended medium. And then we, with our sales and marketing capabilities, we reach the audience across the world. So it's not just, I would not just call it outsourcing, but it's more a partnership in terms of making this world-class education affordable and accessible.
So the faculty remains completely in the picture in some ways.
Yeah, so any good partnership requires the two partners to bring in complementary skill sets or capabilities. The universities, what are they really good at? The core of it, research and teaching. That's their core. In fact, if you give professors a free hand, they'll only do research. They may not even want to teach because that's what they really enjoy. What are we good at? Right? And not, so when you think about new age topics like data science, AI, machine learning, the universities will take some time to teach that in the same way that industry wants those skill sets. And we bring in that angle. Right? So we help them on curriculum, adaptation. We're not teaching the university what to teach.
So you can say you unlock the value of research.
An example is we might bring in a large data set and say, hey, make this part of your course. So it's absolutely partnership. We absolutely respect the universities we work with. And the faculty, like Mohan B is an example, they are innovators as well. And by the way, the faculty in the universities also see this. And so it's really a lovely collaboration that we work towards.
Yeah, but I'm going to ask you a question. It's difficult to juggle a Berkeley with a Haas, with different schools. So they are at some level competitors, right? So is there a conflict of interest issue here, or a Chinese wall issue where you draw between, or is there a collaborative issue where you bring in your own value? Please tell us more about it.
Maybe to start with, it's about how do prospective students or participants choose a university, right? So either somebody in the family have gone to that particular university, or they know from research or ranking a particular university is known for a particular subject, right? So for that sense, maybe people on the west coast of US, Berkeley or Stanford is far more attractive than an MIT. So we don't see one, universities that compete in the space, but we try to provide a platform where on one end we have a host of suppliers or universities providing high quality content. On the other side, we have people from across the world. So the whole idea, that's the part what Pankaj was mentioning about democratization. Let the participants choose, and we are there providing the area of choices. Or
what's the India advantage here? Is it a classic cost-cutting story, or is there something more to this in an Indian company being involved in this?
So, we started off as an Indian company. When we raised our round from Bertelsmann, they fueled our global ambitions. And so we're very happy that they were the right partners for that time. But we are still an Indian company. What does that mean? So actually, I never thought about it as cost advantage, but there are advantages. A bulk of what we do in online courses is out of our Boston office, we work with the faculty to create the instructional design elements. But then it comes back to Mumbai, where we do the post-production, the animation, the editing. And if you think about other industries in Mumbai, and you may know what I'm alluding to, there's actually a lot of talent for post-production, animation. So I don't think of it as cost advantage, though that is advantage. All of our digital marketing for our global courses is done out of India, again, out of our Mumbai office. And we're super proud about that. And so I think India as a whole has a lot of talent for us. We are, fiercely Indian, but we have global ambitions. And one of the things
that... It's an offshore on-site model with a strong innovative spin in, the tools and the content creation and stuff, right?
And technology and digital marketing and our inside sales process. Out of 550 people, 450 are based in India. But having said that, I think one of the things that Indians are very good at is a global mindset. You take a bunch of people who come out from IITs or IIMs or any walk of life in India, we can smell an opportunity, whether that's in your back door or globally, we know how to pursue that. So I think some of that exists because of who we are. But I think the bigger thing in the India angle, I would say, is that when I have seen, for example, family members, 7 lakh students applying to an IIT and some 0.2% get in, right? And you really look at that and you say, wow, we have to do something to solve that problem. That access problem, we feel, it's part of our mission. I think the reason it is because we grew up in India.
Let me be very specific on this, Chaitanya. I know, in terms of cost, what does it mean in terms of compared to what it would have been before Eruditus arrived on this scene?
So just in numbers, right? At the end of, by June 2020, we would have at least 100,000 participants from over 84 countries have accessed or have learned courses from our partner schools across our platform, right? We tend to think that if we didn't exist, these 100,000 people might not have had access to some of the biggest brands and some of the most compelling and impactful learning outcomes they've had.
So the focus is on democratization and large-scale access rather than just the cost aspect. There's a volume game in some way.
It's not just for us, right? It's also on the other side for the universities, and they would not have had access to these kind of participants across the world. And we are not talking about millennials or people with, say, 3 years, 4 years. Across, I think we have, for a lot of our courses, people have 15, 20 years of experience. We have CEOs, CXOs doing online courses. So it's across age groups and at the same time across geographies. That's what's interesting for universities.
What about the faculty and the students? How much do they interact? Are there any visits or a direct face-to-face interaction with faculty?
So we call ourselves SPOCs, Small Private Online Courses, which is to contrast with MOOCs, which are massive open online courses. So in a typical course, let's say we have 300 students. They might be from 80 countries, like Chaitanya said. We'll break them up into sections of about 75 each. Each section will have a faculty or a course leader who will guide that section. Within a section of 75, you'll have learning groups of 6, and you'll do some projects, for example, in that group of 6, and then many assignments, you'll get one-on-one feedback. So we take education as, like I said earlier, you have to have learning outcomes, and that requires some personalized attention.
So you can say it's not just a virtual education, it's a virtualization of the university in some way.
Okay, that's a googly, and I think I might just leave that ball outside the off stump. So I don't know, maybe
it's not a no ball, right?
It's not a no ball. But anyway, and one thing I would like to say is that that is our model. I think there'll be many other models. So for example, we're also now starting to work on boot camp programs. So for example, data science, machine learning, where you don't need to do an MS in, say, data science or computer science to get your first job. And those may be 6-month, 9-month type of journeys, so much more intense. But there we might even be giving them one-on-one mentoring support and very hands-on working on data sets and simulations, because that is the need from the industry side. So there's earlier point somebody said, only 20% of students are actually employable. We're trying to solve that, but not in the traditional university sense of, a master's program, et cetera, but in a bootcamp program, but actually there is no credential. The credential is not important, it's the outcome which is important.
It mimics the fourth industrial revolution in many ways, in the sense that the whole, both the pedagogy as well as the course structure is designed for the contemporary global economy in which there's a huge amount of uncertainty and disruption, yet value creation, right? So give us an example of what kind of courses typically, let's see you reel off some so that people will know what are the kids learning today.
So we might not call them kids because a lot of them are much more older.
Oh, well, I'm old.
Older than you. So I think to Ashwin's point, right, so we could have a course, for example, on artificial intelligence and machine learning applications from Berkeley Haas, where the participants would be there on an 8-week or a 2-month online journey in the similar format that Ashwin described, and they would work on some real data sets. And by data sets, I mean to say it could be about housing prices, or it could be about people shopping on an e-commerce, and get their hands dirty, do a project, and then showcase that project, ability to showcase that project to a potential employer to make them employable. So that's the kind of outcome that we are focusing in, and we push the universities as well as our internal teams to make sure we get these applications out there. And now the technology is enabling us to do that, which might not have been the case a decade ago.
The key point is it's not just about putting content out there online. There's a huge amount of pushing in that sense.
For that, there's Netflix, so I think we go.
That's right. That's a good one. But I'm going to ask you something about scaling in this context. Is it a sort of a linear traction kind of a model where it scales, or is it, I know I heard about 84 countries and 100,000 people benefiting. So is this as good as that in terms of, it's like the Ford Motor Assembly of new age education, or is there something, are there gaps to it, bottlenecks to it?
Yeah, so I think scaling is not completely non-linear, because when you want high learning outcomes, you have some students who require personal attention, and you have to have some amount of learning and relearning for them to do it. But if you embrace online, obviously you can scale much faster than in a traditional classroom. So just to give you a sense, right, for some of our university partners that have been with us for 3 years, their enrollments might have grown about 15x. So the third year is 15 times more than what they had in the first year. The traditional classroom university education in the US, the degree program overall, is growing in a negative rate. Professional education in the US is growing at about 5 to 10%. So scaling is in the magnitude that is much higher than what's happening in the traditional model. But I would always be careful with education. End of the day, we're talking about education. So it's not just the numbers, but also the scaling of the learning outcomes. So I would rather we educate 100,000 students, but with high learning outcomes, than say that we educate 100 million students, but questionable learning outcomes.
So there's a huge skill intensity and employability factor in this.
But a lot of that is changing. For example, now you have coding simulators. So earlier, if somebody wrote a code for a machine learning program, somebody had to sit it, compile it, and then figure out what's wrong. Now a compiler will do that automatically. But you still have to go teach that student what went wrong and how you get better at it, right? So it's getting more scalable. I suppose in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll be even more.
Interesting point is neither of you is an academician. To that extent, there is a huge customer service and entrepreneurial approach to the whole delivery of the...
The opportunity is quite huge. I think earlier some people have said the issue is not about unemployment because of the tech aspects, it's about underemployment. So there are studies which show that there's at least 50% of the working age population, they don't have the skill set to do the jobs that they're meant to do, right? So that itself presents a huge universe for reskilling or upskilling, and which in turn presents an opportunity
that's right.
for.
So it's not just old university courses brought online. There's a huge, it's almost like a recession-proof, given the reskilling and upskilling being required. But let me ask you, look at the whole thing from Bertelsmann's point of view, because I've always been fascinated by education as an investment idea, because one never associated education with, let's say, consumer goods or other B2B kind of things. So do you see this more of a, I mean, how does this look from, as you see it, from an investor's point of view? Is this scalable? Is it exitable? Is it, or is it more of a social or impact investment? The way
I actually believe that the more you scale education, the more social impact it has, and those two are therefore not at divergent, or they're not at odds with each other. But specific to Bertelsmann, when we raised our money from Bertelsmann, we did have other term sheets, but we really liked Bertelsmann, and I guess they liked us. There were two parameters which really mattered to us. First, which I think Pankaj said in the introduction, is that they're eventually owned by a foundation. They have a long-term view on the world. When you have them around for 160 years, 150 years, 180 years, when we work with our university partners, they've been around for that kind of, they don't have a 7-year fund life cycle.
So very patient capital.
Patient capital, they've seen ups and downs, and as entrepreneurs, those are the kind of backers we would like to have. Number two is their focus on education. At the end of the day, we're an education company, ed tech, but ed comes first. And so if you look at their portfolio across the world, now we've tapped into their minds into, say, for example, we're now offering courses in Spanish and Portuguese. They have some of the largest investments, and in fact, even recently did a very large investment in that area. Or what they've done in the US, Udacity is an example, or their understanding of just the OPM space. And by the way, in India as well, the ecosystem that they've built, et cetera. So for us, the fact that they are patient capital and they understand education is very helpful. So, as we think about new business models, like for example, boot camps, there's a lot of insights that we can tap into, because in a sense, through their ecosystem, they have spotted many weak signals. And right, why can't we learn from that?
Interesting. I also found it interesting. For instance, there are some books in the media kit from Penguin Random House and all the whole, even publishing is in some way. As a journalist, I feel that even journalism is a form of education, although it's with a terrible hurry and inaccuracy in some ways. But it's all about absorption, and therefore there's a lot of synergy between publishing and all. But anyway, we'll be taking it out of the context. But I also wanted to ask you about Emeritus, which is the other brand you have. I was thinking of Tintin comics, Eruditus and Emeritus, like Thompson and Thompson, but I was just thinking, tell us more about Emeritus, which sounds like your own proprietary brand. So is this? The
online part of what we do is done through a brand called Emeritus, and programs that involve classroom elements is done through a brand called Eruditus. We seem to have found two Latin words that are difficult to pronounce and all of that.
Sounding important, yeah.
Sounding somewhat important, yeah. Okay. So that's basically the difference. One is online, one looks at classroom programs.
So that means basically there's a place called Emeritus that it can go old-fashioned way instead of getting confused in a disrupted way.
Well, Emeritus is the online brand. The Eruditus is the classroom one.
Yeah, okay. Emeritus is online, so I'm getting confused, just like Thompson and Thompson. Okay. I think we have just enough time for about 2, 3, 4 questions. Anyone out there? Anything? Do I see raised hands?
I think we are standing between them and the lunch.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask questions if nobody answers within 30 seconds. Oh yeah, there you are.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sriram. I'm from a company called Indigo Learn. So my query is, so when you run these classes with professors abroad, right? So how much time do they actually spend? Is it like a classroom physical experience, what they have in those universities where, they teach some class and then the teaching assistants take over? Or is it a lot of it is actually done by somebody else? And pardon me for saying this, but is it more like, they have, do they have enough interest in that? That's my primary question. In the sense they spend like 25% of the time, or they spend 5% of the time and somebody else takes over? How does it work?
So varies for the classroom courses as well as the online courses. The classroom courses, they are teaching. it's the faculty of the schools. For the online courses, we capture the faculty of the school through video lectures, but they spend a significant amount of time in the design before that. They set the curriculum. During the 8-week online course, they may come in for about 4 to 5 live sessions or Q&A. But again, that's the online pedagogy, right? So in some sense, you are getting the faculty through a mix of synchronous and asynchronous.
Interesting. Any other question out there? Yeah, well, I can see a raised hand there behind the camera. Yeah, please stand up because we're getting confused otherwise. Yeah. Can anyone pass a mic or should it?
Thank you. I have essentially 2 questions. My name is Vishal. I'm from a university. So first question is, what will the university of the future look like? Because everybody's been talking about the fact that there's going to be a lot of change and so on and so forth. The other is, how do you measure learning outcomes, in a context which is essentially distant? How do you essentially measure what kind of learning has happened and make sure that whatever you wanted to start off with as far as course objectives are concerned is fulfilled?
First one is gazing into the crystal ball, but let me take a shot. So I guess there would be maybe 2 models. One is the traditional model with all maybe the top 20, 30 universities that will still be there, which have been around for decades. But of course, with their curriculum as well as the pedagogy refreshed to suit what the corporate requires. The second thing is, what I would say is that it's continuous learning will become the paradigm or the norm, because the way technology is disrupting, the way is data is influencing every sector, the kind of skills that you need on an ongoing basis, that's going to be very, very dynamic. So how people get a degree or a diploma, etc., I think that fashion is going to change, and universities would be providing programs to suit that. So that's what I would maybe hazard a guess, or that's what I think where the system is going.
Just on that, first of all, before wondering about what the university of the future will look like, let me just say that the future is there'll be less universities. And so depending on which end of the spectrum you are, you can either imagine a bleak future or a bright future. For example, just think about it. At the moment an IIT comes out and says, I will offer a 2-year MS online, and I'm not limited now in my capacity to select 100 students. I mean, we all know the joke, right? People want to go to IIT to do MS in computer science, but they do oceanography because only 100 seats were there. So the moment IIT says, now my capacity for the MS in computer science is 5,000 students. And let's imagine every single IIT does that. And imagine they can deliver that with high quality learning outcomes, which is the key. I always say that is the key. So you can have 50,000 people. Your acceptance rates on the G will be like, what, 10% versus 1%. Then think about the 3rd-tier university in some town. What's its reason to exist?
Yeah, actually, that's interesting because it sounds a lot like my industry media. If you replace the word university with newspaper, you realize what's the relevance of newspapers in this day and age. And then you suddenly realized, like fake news, you have fake education going around. And like in news, you have to identify the outcome of the news and make sure that a rumor doesn't become news, although these days we have what I call the WhatsApp university telling us all sorts of things that's not true. But so therefore, even education will go through a shakeout in which you'll probably have to separate the men from the boys all over again. And maybe your outcome-based model is where they will.
So your second question on learning outcomes is critical, by the way, because ultimately quality is what will lead to sustainable growth in education. But just on the earlier point, not just the universities will disrupt. Private players who are in kind of the non-credential space will also disrupt. Like, do you even need a master's in computer science, say 10 years from now? So if you are a university that doesn't have high learning outcomes, good luck, the future is bleak for you. You might as well start thinking about that today. Learning outcomes is a whole long conversation. When I'm asked this, I'm always curious, why do people ask about learning outcomes for online only? Why don't I ask about learning outcomes for classroom? So please give me the parameters with which you measure learning outcomes for classroom. We can measure the same online and much, much more.
Well, that's very interesting. It's like saying, why do you need marriage if your relationship is good enough?
I didn't say that.
Okay, we have to wake up people before lunch, right? So another point is that you're asking a profound question, because in classrooms, we remember in school days, there were teachers who would taunt us, right thing to say on Teachers' Day, like, Are you physically present and mentally absent? So if you're mentally present, it doesn't matter whether you're online or offline. And the whole thing, from a journalist point of view, I feel that very often, I used to tell my team in the newsroom, no, you're not in the news business, you're in the aha business, which means that if you don't wake up people, you're not being newsy enough. So same thing, if you don't make people learn, it's not education enough. Of course, there's a profound question, which is that we repeatedly use the word skills here, whereas actually some of the education is beyond skills at the level of philosophy or concept. I think that's where universities will remain at the high end of, this thing. Any other question out there? I think we really have to, you're the last question, sir. Sorry, yeah, please. I think we are on time. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And this is the last question we're done.
Hey, my name is Sandeep. I think it's fantastic. My question to you is, in this whole drive and the endeavor towards digitization of education, massify scale, whatever it is, what is it that you're doing or you're thinking in terms of humanizing the delivery of education? A whole lot of the education space that we are in is about character and competence. So I don't have any doubts on the competence part, which will get built. But we've grown up through peer learning, right? A lot of physical FaceTime interaction, observation, social learnings from each other. So how do you see an organization like, let's say, Eruditus that you're talking about, bringing in the humanization of education, so the whole development is more holistic and not just on the competence part and the technical part?
I guess that element can't start once you're 30 years old or 35 years old. I think the whole, it has to run through
It reminds me of my father, who used to say, education is what remains after all that you've learned has been forgotten. So it's like character building or something hardwired into your personality. But there is a lot of interesting stuff going on. There are neuroscience courses going on these days. It's a fascinating muse for anyone interested in education, because even characters can be interpreted in terms of nervous system. Maybe there's a pedagogical thing there, or maybe there is a, even, watching a good movie like, what's that, Scent of a Woman can be good for character education. So everything depends on that, but I take your point.
Is it getting impersonal?
I think, yeah,
is it getting mechanical?
You're touching
is it getting impersonal?
You're touching the moral core of education, which is very interesting, but that's probably why writers and journalists exist, That gives us a job to do, because we keep poking on that side of the post on what does it mean to society or humanity kind of a thing.
So I think, your point is valid. And there are skills, there are STEM kind of education, which obviously is easier to go online. Liberal arts will take longer. But if you guys have noticed, recently Penn said that they're offering their bachelor's, so Penn is Ivy League, University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League institution, and they're offering their bachelor's program completely online. So early days. To me, it's a weak signal. If a Ivy League education institution believes that liberal arts, bachelor's education, which in the US is a mix of liberal and STEM.
No, I can say a lot on this. Psychometric tests exist, and there are ways to actually even standardize some aspects.
Just to give an example, right, to close out, MIT, we have in fact funded that research. They have done some research on social physics. So in online, you're a distributed team. How can you have a software running beneath your video conferencing solution, which tells you how much limelight you have hogged or airtime you have hogged, and which gives you the input that, look, this person who is sitting in Mexico City, who is part of the conference, you haven't even asked any question, or he or she is feeling left out. It's time for them to ask questions. So there are ways in which technology is trying to bring out that element of collaboration.
Very interesting. It's like financial inclusion. It's a pedagogical inclusion of some kind. Very interesting.
So, early days, but I take your point. I think that there has to be emphasis there.
Very interesting. This can go on and on, because it's touching areas of psychology that I'm fascinated by, but then it's time for lunch and time to wind up. Only can quote Mark Twain, who said that, I never let school interfere with my education. To that extent, everything in the end is with the self. So you can't, change everything through a education process of an institution, but the sky's the limit. There is technology and all. Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you, Chaitanya.
Thanks,
Hope
Madhavan.
this has been useful
Thank
to
you.
you.